Well, basically, I have a pilot's license, and for a number of years, I had my own small airplane. It was a little Cessna 150, and I loved that little plane. Unfortunately, it kind of got to the point where my mechanic retired, my flight instructor retired, the local airport started charging more fees, and so aviation was getting more and more expensive, where I could not afford to continue. And so I sold my little airplane a few years ago. But in the process of flying, I did have an engine failure, and it was quite an experience. I had flown to Vernal, Utah, uh, which is a 3-hour flight, uh, basically to the northeast, over two very large sets of mountains, and everything was fine. It was very cold, and I went to Vernal for a falconers convention, and so I went there to uh, just attend the convention. And New Year's Day, I needed to get back home, and so I I instructed the FBO, which is the company that sells gas and does maintenance on airplanes at airports, called the FBO. And I notified the FBO that I would be leaving very, very early Thursday morning to get to, so that I could be home for Thanksgiving here in Enoch. And so when I got to the airport about 6 o'clock in the morning, um, I went into the office of the FBO, and it says, my plane ready? And the guy says, oh, I forgot to fill up your plane with gas. I'll go do it right now. And so he drove the fuel truck out to my plane and filled my plane with gas. And while he was filling my plane with gas, I have a small space heater that's run on a propane bottle that I stick underneath the cowling to blow warm air into the engine to warm up the engine and the oil, so that the engine would run. And it was very, very, very cold. It was down in close to the single digits, so it was super, super cold. And we he got the plane fueled up, and I finished my uh, pre-flight checklist to make sure everything was fine, and I paid the gas bill, and I started up the airplane, and my airplane fired up perfectly, uh, and I taxied out and got on the runway, and I took off, and I headed south toward Price, Utah. And from Vernal to Price, there's about, I don't know, 30, 40 miles of desert. And then you cross some 10,000-foot mountains. And then on the south side of the 10,000-foot mountains was the city of Price. And that's the next airport. But I should be able to make it all the way home with, completely full of gas. And so I climbed up to 12,000 feet as I was crossing the 10,000-foot mountains to give me plenty of clearance. And as I got to 12,000 feet and I was over the mountains, my engine started to run very, very badly. And this is the first time with this little Cessna 150 that my engine wasn't 100% reliable. And it just started to run really terrible. And so I adjusted the fuel mixture for, the higher you go, the thinner the air. So you need to reduce the fuel so your fuel and air mixture is correct, and you have to adjust that knob a little bit. And so I'm adjusting the fuel mixture and trying to get the engine to run better. The engine's running really, really bad. And, I am really starting to get worried because I'm right over the top of the mountains. And all of a sudden, the engine quit. And so I'm 12,000 feet over 10,000-foot mountains, and there's no way that I can make it to Price. There's no way that I can make it to Vernal. And if I can't get the engine to run, um, I'm going to have to put this airplane down somewhere. And so my first thought was, you know, what my flight instructor taught me: fly the plane. No matter what happens, fly the plane. Don't worry about the engine. Don't worry about anything else. Just make sure that the plane is flying and that you've got control. And so basically, with the engine out, adjusting my trim, I turned away from the mountains and started heading back toward the open desert. And as I started heading back toward the open desert, I went from 2,000 feet above the ground to now about 9,000 feet above the ground. So now I've got a little time. I've got 9,000 feet of elevation, and what I'm doing is I'm piloting a glider. An airplane without an engine's a glider. Even though a good sailplane can have a glide ratio of 50-1, which means you can go 50 feet forward for every foot that you drop. My Cessna has about a 7-1 glide ratio, so I go 7 feet forward for every foot that I go down, and so I'm flying. I'm in control. Now I'm looking for a place to land. I've got lots of altitude, and way off in the distance I can see an alfalfa field, but I don't think I can make it to the alfalfa field. Below me there are 2-track Jeep trails. There is sagebrush. There are gullies and ditches. Not the best place in the world to put down a small airplane. My little Cessna, I was modified with stole tips and heavier landing gear and vortex generators, and so my airplane, I could fly it really super slow. And so I wasn't afraid that I was going to crash and die, but I was afraid that what I was going to do is I was going to break my airplane. And so scanning the area, looking for a place to land, there's not a whole lot of choices. I have one kind of 2-track that I can make, and so I've got lots of time, I've got lots of altitude, so things are in control. It's now time to try to restart the engine. And so I go through the starting procedures. Basically the key's been turned off because the engine's not running. The key's turned off. So now it's time to set the throttle and to basically go through my restart procedures and turn the key back on. And so I turn the key back on, and all of a sudden there is an explosion. It literally sounded like a cannon went off. It sounded like I blew the engine right off the airplane. And just literally scared the hell out of me, because I thought for sure, this was it, I'm going to die. But the airplane was still flying. And so I immediately recognized that we're still flying, we're still gliding, and much to my surprise, the engine was running, but it was running really badly. And so I basically went back and started to deal with the fuel mixture and see if I can get that engine to run properly. And with little adjustments and very gently, the engine started to come on a little more and a little more and a little more till the engine was running normally. And of course that made me feel much better. I've got an engine running. There's an old joke among pilots that says that the reason for the propeller at the front of the airplane is not to drive the airplane, it's to keep the pilot cool, because when that stopped, the pilot starts sweating like hell. And that's very true. It's the stress level goes completely nuts when all of a sudden you realize you don't have power, you don't have an engine anymore, that the propeller has stopped. Well, the plane's running now. I'm on the radio. I'm calling Vernal. the airport, and I'm heading that direction. And Vernal doesn't have a mechanic on duty on Thanksgiving, so I call the next airport, which is Marysvale, kind of close to Vernal. And I call that airport, and there's no assistance there whatsoever. In fact, nobody even answered the radio there, and so there's virtually no communication. I call flight service, but with flight service, I'm really in the middle of nowhere. I'm very much on my own, and so this moment, the closest airport is Marysvale, and so I head that direction, and I'm slowly climbing, building altitude, and I get right over the airport. And so now that the plane seems to be running just fine, and I'm over an airport, and so now it's time to see what happens, to see if I can get the engine to stop again. Because now I know that if I lose my engine, I can make an engine out landing. I've practiced that many times. I'm safe now. I'm over an airport. And so I move the throttle in and out. I adjust the mixture settings. I pulled the airplane up into a stall. I did everything I could to see if I put stress on that engine, to see if I get that engine to stop. And the engine seemed to be just fine. That everything was working properly. The plane was flying properly. Okay, well, let me turn around and start heading back home. So I climbed up back to about 12,000 feet again, and I started heading south. And so from this moment on, I tried very, very hard to fly a course that kept something within sight where I could land, whether it was a road, whether it was an agricultural field, just something and so I would go from landing zone to landing zone to landing zone as I headed back. And so when I got over the mountains, everything was fine. When I could see the airport at Price, I knew I was okay, that I could make it. And then I just, like I said, really made absolutely certain that everywhere that I went, I had a place to put the airplane down if the engine failed again. So coming south, following landing zones, crossing the Colorado Plateau Mountains, kept instead of just going straight across, I followed the freeway through the mountains. So I kept roads, in sight. So if anything went wrong, I had a place to put the plane down. And got over Parowan, which is about 20 miles north of here. Everything's still good. Headed for Cedar City, the Cedar City Airport, and everything was fine. And I landed at the Cedar City Airport, taxied to my parking space, and parked my airplane. And I have never been so glad to have my feet on the ground when I got that plane parked, and the plane just flew like nothing had happened, like everything was just perfectly fine. And got out of the plane, pulled the hood, looked at the engine, looked at everything. I couldn't find anything wrong with the hood or the engine. And so I tested the fuel again. We have a sump in each of the tank, and you push a little test tube up on a little valve, and it drains a little bit of fuel from the very, very bottom of the tank. And if you have water in the fuel, then you keep draining that fuel until it comes out clean, so there's no more water in the fuel. And what I found is I had water in my fuel. And so what had happened was that the fuel that I got in Vernal, I made a critical error. And the critical error I made was, after my plane was fueled by the fuel truck, I did not sit around for at least a half an hour to an hour, so that if by chance we got some water from the fuel in the fuel truck, and that does happen. Basically, what happens is, if the fuel in the fuel truck is low, a condensation occurs in the tank, and the condensation drips into the fuel, and that's water. The water ends up at the bottom, so the first thing you get is water out of the fuel. And that's exactly what happened. Is I got water in my fuel, and as I got to altitude, and at 12,000 feet, it was significantly below zero. My fuel lines, the water in the fuel line froze and stopped the fuel from getting to my engine. But once I got down low enough and restarted the engine, it sucked that ice and stuff through and blew it out, and the engine started to run. And so it was fuel in the fuel lines that caused the engine out failure. I should have, and I know better than this, I should have, after my airplane was fueled, I should have gone to breakfast. And I should have come back an hour later and then test the fuel, and if there were water, then keep draining the water out until I was running pure gas. And then when I was running pure gas, then take off. And I did not do that, and that was my mistake. So we're back in Cedar City. We're safe. I drained the rest of the water out of my fuel, and I had a good story to tell my flight instructor, because I was a relatively new pilot at the time, and he was very proud that I was able to deal with that situation. He was happy that his student was able to think well. You know, they do say that for an airplane accident to be fatal, it takes 3 mistakes. And you know, I made the mistake of not allowing the fuel to settle in my tanks after being fueled up by the tanker truck, and that was my mistake. When I was over the 10,000 foot mountains and my engine quit, I did not make what would have been a critical mistake, is if I were to say, well, I'll try to keep going toward Vernal. I immediately looked for a place to land and turned away from the mountains, and that gave me, from, like I said, from 2,000 feet above the ground to 9,000 feet above the ground, and gave me time. And then once I determined that the engine was running, everything was good, I did everything I could to push the engine to see if I could cause the failure again, which didn't happen. And then for the rest of my trip, I kept places that I could land in sight everywhere I went until I got back to Cedar City. So the only true mistake I made was not allowing time for the water to settle in the fuel tank. And so I had 1 mistake. I didn't have 3 mistakes, and that's why I'm here today to talk about it, because I made some good decisions as a relatively new pilot. And so that's my story. That's how we had an engine failure in my airplane and lived to talk about it.